Welcome back to the International Symposia on Alternatives Assessments. My name is Bob Skoglund, and I will be your host for this second session. If I could have the second slide, please. The second session is titled Safe and Sustainable Alternatives. The methods and strategies to identify and evaluate safe and sustainable alternatives to chemicals used in processes and products are becoming more prevalent. In this session, we will hear from speakers that will present specific case studies, as well as techniques for evaluating and identifying safe and sustainable alternatives. Next slide, please. Before we get into the session, I'd just like to thank our sponsors for this meeting. Without their generosity, this would be a very difficult meeting to pull off. Thank you, sponsors. Next slide, please. So let's take a minute and just talk about session etiquette. I'm sure you're all suffering from Zoom fatigue anyway, but you've done this many times. Ask everybody to keep your lines muted and your videos off, but we will have some opportunities for interaction. So if you would add your full name and organization to your picture. If you're not familiar with how to do that, just hover over your picture and click on it, and it will give you an opportunity to update your name. Our recommendation is that you use the speaker view in Zoom. We believe that this is the best viewing experience. During the Q&A portion of the session, if you wish to ask a question or offer a comment, please raise your hand. We'll show you how to do that in a second. Feel free to unmute your line and turn on your video so we have some engagement, but we ask you to limit this to the Q&A portion. You're certainly welcome to use the chat during the session, and obviously anything that's entered into the chat we'll bring up during the Q&A session. This session is being recorded, and it will be made available to A4 members immediately, and in 2 months it'll be made available to the public. Next slide, please. So just some instructions on how to raise your hand if you're not familiar with it. First, open the participants icon at the bottom of your computer screen. When the participants view opens, you'll be able to find the raise hands icon list at the bottom. Please help us by lowering your hands. Toggle on the icon when you finish with your question or comment. And just a reminder, the chat also works. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, my name is Bob Skoglund. Whoops, sorry about that. I lost my view here. Okay. As I mentioned, my name is Bob Skoglund. I'm the Director of Product Safety and Regulatory Affairs with Covestro. And as I mentioned, I will be moderating this section. We have 4 speakers, 4 presentations. The first one is Greg Morose, Research Manager with the Massachusetts Toxic Use Reduction Institute. The second speaker will be Geetesh Devineni. I apologize if I didn't get that name right. He is a research assistant, George Washington University. Our third speaker will be Stefanie Wieck, environmental engineer with the German Environment Agency. And our final speaker will be Lei Wang, research area specialist, University of Michigan. Now, each participant, each presenter is going to have 15 minutes. I will be giving you a gentle nudge when you have about a minute left, and then we'll take 5 minutes for questions after each presenter. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, Greg. Next slide, please. Okay, Greg, the podium is yours.
You're muted.
Greg, I'm not hearing you.
How about now?
Now I do. Thank you, Greg.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. And as you probably are aware, highly toxic solvents such as methylene chloride, TCE, and ethylbenzene, and many others are commonly used in a variety of products and applications. So today I'll be discussing how to apply a chemistry theory that's called the Hansen solubility parameter theory to identify safer solvents that can be used to replace these highly toxic solvents that are being used currently. Okay, so first, just want to cover a few chemistry terms, and I'm not a chemist, so I'll keep it simple. Basically, just want to make sure we all understand a solute is a substance that is being dissolved. A solvent is a substance that actually dissolves the solute, and then once it's dissolved, it forms a solution. So something you're familiar with is salt as a solute, water as a solvent, and when you mix them together, the salt dissolves and it forms salt water. And for today, we're going to be talking mostly with solutes that are polymer based. So the Hansen solubility parameters, it's a theory used to predict what would be the best solvents or solvent blends to dissolve a particular solute of interest. And it's based on 3 intermolecular forces, and it does not include ionic forces, so therefore we don't typically use it for aqueous applications, but we use it for all other solvent applications. So the first intermolecular force is a polar force, or called dipole-dipole force. So these dipoles are created when individual atoms within a molecule have different electronegativity values. So this causes polarization, where one side of the molecule is negative and the other is positive. So the attractive force between the positive end of one polar molecule and the negative end of the other, another polar molecule, that force between those molecules is called the polar force. Second type of intermolecular force is called dispersion or London force. And this force arises because you have an electron cloud that spins around the atoms. And on average, it's evenly distributed, but at any given moment, it's typically not evenly distributed. So this causes a temporary non-localized, which is why we call it dispersion force. And again, it creates a positive and negative side of the molecule, and the positive side of one attracts the negative side of the other molecule. The third type of intermolecular force is hydrogen bonding. And this occurs when you have molecules with high electronegative values, such as fluorine or oxygen, and they're bound directly to hydrogen. So this little graph here shows you the difference between a covalent bond. So within a water molecule with 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, you've got a covalent bond between the hydrogen and the oxygen. But when you have multiple molecules of water, it's the hydrogen bond force that's between the molecules. So now we have these 3 intermolecular forces. We graph them in 3-dimensional space using one for the x-axis, one for the y-axis, and one for the z-axis. And by doing this, we can plot all the solvents and solutes in this 3-dimensional space. And this round sphere represents a solute, and it represents a sphere of solubility, so that any solvent that resides within this sphere, such as represented by these green dots, would be able to dissolve that solvent, that solute. And any solvent that's outside of this sphere of solubility, represented by these red dots, would not be able to dissolve that solute. The next concept is relative energy difference. So basically, in a nutshell, for that sphere of solubility for a solute, the closer you are to the center of that sphere, the solvent to that center, then the better it will be at dissolving that solute. So it can do it more rapidly and with less agitation or time or temperature. And the further you get to this from the center of that sphere, the slower it takes. And once you get outside that sphere, like that red dot, red cube, that's not going to dissolve it at all. So here is the real immense value of using this theory. So if you have a sphere of solubility and you're trying to replace a solvent, toxic solvent that's used to dissolve that, if you look at solvent A and solvent B, they are both outside of that sphere of solubility. So your first thought would be, they're both not good candidates for this application. They'll never dissolve that polymer. However, if you blend those two solvents, in this case, 50%, 50% for each, and create a solvent blend, that resultant dispersion, polar, and hydrogen bonding force values now goes inside of that sphere of solubility, and that is a viable alternative. So that's a very powerful way of using this method. So here, so we're focusing on the toxicity of the solvents, and we tend to use the green screen chemical hazard assessment methodology that was developed by Clean Production Action. And it basically categorizes all chemicals into 4 different benchmark levels. And benchmark 1 is the highest hazard, and basically you want to avoid it. It's a chemical of high concern. An example would be benzene as a solvent. So you want to move to increasing levels of safety. So benchmark 2 is safer, and benchmark 3 is safer than a 2, and benchmark 4 is the safest. So benchmark 2 would be like ethanol. Benchmark 3, an example, is propylene carbonate, where it's safer than ethanol, and then all the way to benchmark 4, where you go to water. But the main thing is we want to just avoid the benchmark 1 chemicals. Okay, so what's the process? The process is, first you need to determine the requirements for the specific application that you're looking for. And there's 4 major categories. So you want to look at cost. You want to look at performance. So this is factors that require testing to evaluate. So you want to make sure the solute dissolves in a certain amount of time. If you were looking at adhesives, you'd want to test and measure the bonding strength. So whatever the specific requirements that need to be tested. Then the next category is physical properties, and these are inherent to the individual solvents that you are going to investigate. So some examples are evaporation rate, color, specific gravity. So for your application, what is the range of acceptable evaporation rate that you can use? Then finally, the 4th category is environmental health and safety. So things such as VOC content of your product formulation. And again, the thing that we focus heavily on is no green screen benchmark 1 chemicals. So the good news is there's a software program that's available, the Hansen Solubility Parameters in Practice, or HSPIP, that is available to really increase the efficiency of using this theory. So basically it has a database of HSP values for thousands of solvents and solutes. And if you want to investigate a solvent that's not already in there, then it helps to calculate the HSP values for the solvents. You use the SMILES notation. And for a solute, you would do some experimental work and then plug that in, and it would create the sphere of solubility for that solute. So it provides all the graphs, it provides a spreadsheet of values. And also, when we talked before about solvent blends, it goes through thousands of solvents and finds potential solvent blends that would be viable alternatives as well. So you start with thousands of different solvents, and then the whole process is you need to keep narrowing it down until you get down to a final solvent blend. So this is a bit of a process, but the first thing you do is you look at all those 4 categories of solvent requirements that we had, and that really helps to narrow down the field. Then you start doing performance testing on some of the initial potential candidates and use that for further down selecting what solvent blends to go to. And the thing to remember, it's an iterative process. You just don't go straight line down to a final solvent blend. It's iterative, and you kind of have to go back, try a few other ones, get some results, and go back and try a few more until you get to that final solvent blend. And there's also software tools that can help in this process. So in addition to HSPIP, you can export the data out to Excel or MATLAB, so you can do further data manipulation and looking at other alternative blends, especially focusing on the cost and performance attributes, which isn't included in HSPIP. So between those different software tools, you can really manipulate the data and find the final solvent blends. So just want to give you a couple of quick examples of how we've used this and been successful. So first one is contact adhesives. The green screen benchmark 1 solvents are toluene and hexane. And our industry partner that we worked with is ITW Polymer Sealants. And we found a safer solvent blend, a ternary blend with 3 different solvents to replace that. And the results are published in the International Journal of Adhesion and Adhesives. Another application, and this one's more manufacturing process related, and it's the use of methylene chloride in manufacturing APIs or active pharmaceutical ingredients. And our industry partner was Johnson Matthey, and we found a binary solvent blend to replace methylene chloride. And the results of this research is published in the Journal of Separations. A third application that we used this process for was to replace dimethylformamide, or DMF. And the DMF was used to dissolve a polyurethane in a textile coating process. And our industry partner was Bradford Coatings, and we were able to find a binary solvent blend mixture to replace the DMF. And the results of this are published in the Journal of Cleaner Production. And a fourth application to mention is paint and varnish removers, which are heavily solvent-based and use a variety of different benchmark 1 solvents, including methylene chloride, NMP, toluene, ethylbenzene, and several others. So we were able to find a ternary solvent blend that would work comparable to, better than most and comparable to methylene chloride-based products. And our industry partner was Super Remover, and this blend was actually patented and commercialized and is currently available for use. So future potential applications, there's still a lot of solvents used in a lot of different applications. So PVC cement, which is used by plumbers and do-it-yourself homeowners across the country, uses THF, a carcinogen. So that's an opportunity there. There are several products that use PERC and methylene chloride and other toxic chemicals, such as mold release products, brake cleaners and auto shops, variety of different types of sealants. And then for industrial parts cleaning, which is used for all different industries. They all need to clean some contaminant off a substrate. And there's a variety of benchmark 1 chemicals used there, such as PERC and TCE and NPB. So there's a lot of future potential applications to use this approach to find solutions for these applications as well. So that's it for my presentation, and I understand we have a few minutes, and I'd be glad to take some questions.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I was just coming up on the 1-minute warning, so perfect timing. Thank you very much for keeping it in the allotted time. Does anybody want to ask a question? Unmute your microphone, show us your video. I'm monitoring the chat. I'm not seeing anything in the chat yet. Greg, I have a question. In terms of when you work with customers and application development, do they come to you, or what is the initial sort of business relationship with these customers? And then are there IP issues that need to be dealt with and ownership issues of solutions?
Yes, so the typical method that we engage industry partners in this process is every year the Toxic Use Reduction Institute has what we call academic research grant process, where we provide funding for University of Massachusetts faculty and graduate students to do research that's toxic use reduction related. And we go out and talk to various companies, mostly in Massachusetts, and that are using toxic chemicals, and see if they're interested in this program. And Turi funds the research. So we'll fund the faculty member and the graduate students and undergraduate students to work on this. But we do like to engage an industry partner so that we have technical input to both the research plan and to the research results as we go through them, to make sure that the industry, the research is grounded, and we come up with results that are valuable for industry. So since the Turi is funding it, then the intellectual property that does come out of any of these research efforts is owned and controlled by the university. And typically what we do is we let the industry partner have first opportunity to license the intellectual property, either on an exclusive or non-exclusive basis, but they usually get the first crack at it, and that's how we handle that process.
Okay, thanks, Greg. We do have some questions in the chat. Let me read the first one. Hi, Greg. Thank you for the presentation and inspiring work. Am I correct in thinking that an earlier version of your solvent blend included DMSO rather than 1,3-dioxylane? I'm not sure if that's a spelling error. I'm not familiar with that chemical. If yes, can you describe the thought process that led you to that switch? Topher, if you can just enlighten me on what the 1,3 chemical is. I'm not sure what that is.
1,3-dioxylane is a solvent.
Okay, my mistake.
And I assume they're talking about the paint remover, because we've used DMSO and 1,3-dioxylane in various different applications. But if we're talking about the paint remover, there's actually two variations. One is a ternary blend that has, it's got methyl acetate, 1,3-dioxylane, and DMSO. But we also have another formulation that does not have DMSO, and that has become of interest recently because there are two major manufacturers of DMSO in the world, one in China and one in the US, and the DMSO production plant in China blew up earlier this year. So now the US plant is trying to supply the world. So the price of DMSO has gone up about 400%. So that has been a driver to move to the other formulation that doesn't have DMSO. So it was really a cost driver.
Okay, thanks, Greg, and thanks, Topher, for clearing that up. Yes, it was the paint remover was the question. Another question, is the HSP software publicly available?
Yes, it's HSP IP, and it's publicly available, and it's very, I think, cost effective. Basically, when I got it, it was $1,200 for a license, and it's a perpetual license, so you have it for as long as you want. So we got our money's worth after one project, and we've been using it for about 6 years now, and continue to use it. So it's a great thing to have. And if you're interested in it, I can give you more information and even give you some training slides.
Okay, thanks, Greg. One more question in the chat. Hi, Greg. What indicators do you use for environmental health and safety?
Well, as I mentioned, we use the green screen methodology quite extensively. And that has 18 different hazard endpoints encompassed within it. So I would say we use those. But sometimes we are concerned about things that aren't included in the green screen. And an example of that would be VOC content. So a lot of formulations require a certain percentage to be VOC content. So that's like an example of how we'd have to look at the green screen and have to look outside as well, or augment it with other information to get a full EH&S profile.
Okay, thanks, Greg. I think we've exhausted the questions in the chat and we've used up our time. So let me just take one more moment to thank Greg for his presentation. And we'll move on to our next speaker. So if we could move on to the next slides, please. And then Geetesh, you're up next. Let's just do a sound check to make sure we can hear you.
Hello.
Okay, I can hear you. Thank you. The podium is yours.
All right, so you just heard about some computational tools for screening alternatives. So I'm going to hopefully, I'm going to talk about another computational model that can hopefully be used to screen alternatives for an important endpoint for bioaccumulation. And that would be our bioconcentration model. So studying bioconcentration is important since it's closely related to bioaccumulation and biomagnification of a chemical through higher trophic levels. This often leads to undesirable adverse effects across species. So the process of bioconcentration refers to the absorption and retention of a substance through thermal and respiratory surfaces, and this excludes contributions from dietary uptake. So it's quantified using a bioconcentration factor, log BCF, which is defined as the ratio of the chemical concentration in the organism versus in the water at steady state. So in the case of fish, it involves two competing processes, the uptake of the substance through the gills and chemical elimination. So often BCF is used in regulatory decisions where companies are required to test their compounds. Cutoff values are often used to describe highly bioaccumulative compounds. These animal tests are very expensive. One EPA estimate from 2018 states about $145,000 to $165,000 for oyster and fish respectively. So due to their high economic and ethical costs, predictive models such as QSARs look as attractive alternatives. So QSARs use relationships between physiochemical properties and experimental BCF to make predictions. The first model was developed in 1974 and stemmed from the assumption that the octanol water partition coefficient can be predictive of BCF, which was based on simple regression analysis. So there are more recent models, which include BCF-WIN, Kokawe, Oasis, and Vega Caesar. So BCF-WIN is contained in the EPA's EpiSweep program. Kokawe adapted the BCF-WIN model and extended its applicability to hydrocarbons. Oasis uses the concept of a maximum BCF value and then considers processes such as biotransformation as reducing factors. Vega Caesar was specifically developed with REACH guidelines in mind by the European Commission in an effort to standardize models for regulatory use. So existing models reveal some challenges in predicting BCF robustly. Usually a mechanistic interpretation occurs after the model has been developed and not prior. So there's an emphasis on parent compounds, which may create training set bias, and the model's predictions might be dubious when venturing into a different chemical space. So ionizable compounds are not explicitly modeled, but we know the ionization affects permeability and bioavailability. And the test conditions for BCF are also not 100% realistic when compared to the real aquatic environment. The fish are kept in tanks and administered the chemical in certain dosage thresholds and observed over a period of time. So considering these challenges, we put forth a few hypotheses to try and improve upon existing BCF modeling. First, we incorporated ionization and considered ionizable compounds in our data set. We use reactivity metrics to identify compounds with specific mechanisms, and we do consider metabolism, which can improve modeling as well. So for our model, we use the NITE dataset, which was originally combined with an exon dataset. But since the exon dataset relied on different species and involved extrapolated data points as well, it was set aside to be used for external validation. We should note for mechanistic models, which our model is, the size of the data set is less important than the quality of the measurements and the diversity of compounds, which I will discuss later. Of the 241 compounds of the NITE set that we looked at, 203 were neutral and 38 were ionizable at a physiological pH of 7.4. So looking closer at the ionizable species, we went through the data set and looked at compounds and their ionization species distribution. We needed a reasonable cutoff, so we considered a compound ionizable if a form exists at a greater than 0.01% abundance. So to generate descriptors for our model, we relied not on partition coefficients derived from single structures, but on Monte Carlo simulations in an explicit medium to calculate short and long range solute-solvent interactions. So we used molecular interactions data to generate ADME properties and partition coefficients. So in addition to the ADME properties, each chemical was screened for mechanistic patterns to identify potential transformation pathways. Shown here are examples of Michael addition and shift-based formation transformations, which are relevant for endpoints such as mutagenicity, sensitization, or oxidative stress. We can also assign specific mechanisms as well as metabolic transformations as shown in the middle pie charts. The fish cytochrome P450 on the right is an example of a proxy that would be screened using the protein for phase 1 metabolism. It's important to consider reactivity and metabolism since the experimental BCF value comes from the parent compound, and these transformations can overpredict BCF in the model since the transformed species are usually more soluble and less lipophilic. ADME is also important when considering bioavailability and clearance rates. So after parameter generation, we looked at the data to find trends. We saw that completely ionized compounds have very low BCF values, which is not surprising. So functional classes such as amines, carboxylic acids, and sulfonates with BCF values less than 1 can be excluded from a model. However, compounds with lower ionization abundance must be considered in the model since their neutral form drives permeability, and so their BCF can be higher. Next, we look at trends in reactivity and ionizability. We see no real difference across reactivity metrics, but we do see a different spread of the data in ionizable versus non-ionizable species. And on the right, we see that there's no difference slope-wise in compounds identified as electrophiles and non-reactive compounds. However, there is a clear difference for compounds identified for potential metabolic transformations and the rest of the data. So this goes back to the concept of BCF values originating from the parent compound, so it's important to identify these potential metabolized species. So looking closer at the electrophilic reactivity on the left and the metabolic reactivity on the right, we see that there could be a difference. But to elucidate this difference, we need to look more closely at compounds and define actual metabolites, since the data generation only flags potential metabolic transformations. So considering these trends, our model development was based on a few decisions. First, we used a well-known linear range for BCF, where log P is greater than 0 and less than 7. And then for our initial models, we focused on splitting the data into ionizable and non-ionizable compounds. So during model development, we had to select our variable descriptors. So on the left are the ionizable compound variables, and on the right are the non-ionizable variables. So we use these plots to reduce highly cross-correlated variables and kept the ones more correlated to log BCF, the experimental value. It's a little hard to see, but this was helpful to eliminate the highly correlated variables that often showed up in the ionizable data set, since it contained information from both the neutral and the most abundant species. So moving on to model development, shown on the left is the ionizable model with an R-squared of 0.65. And this may seem a bit lower, but the additional challenge of all of these points is that they fall in a very narrow BCF range. And on the right is the non-ionizable model with an R-squared of 0.80. And so looking at the compounds, we can see that in red are the reactives and the metabolic species. In the case of underfit molecules, we actually ran into this epoxide, which presented an additional challenge. Since it's highly reactive, we would expect that it would be overfit due to reactivity. The additional chlorination drives this bioconcentration. So since the predicted BCF was lower for these perhalogenated compounds, we believe a good solution here is to make a separate model for this specific chemical class and use this as an approach for future chemical classes that may look like outliers. All right, so on the left, in these values, sorry, on the left is a k-fold cross-validation with 6 folds, which is roughly about 20% of the data. And then the R-squared from the right is from another validation procedure. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I'm missing a chart, but that's my bad. So we just did internal validation here, leave one out, and then 20% of the data was tested against the model, and I had those data written down as well. But further external validation needs to be done. So in conclusion, we recognize the need for better predictive models for BCF, and the previous models based only on one descriptor can be improved upon. We should also be able to use these models to develop mechanistic insight or find variations by chemical class to guide safer chemical design. We also showed that treating ionization separately can improve models, but more work needs to be done, which includes finding specific reactive and metabolic species to involve more data, such as the Exxon data set that we left out. So we're currently working with toxicological collaborators to find a meaningful way to do this across different species and different data sets. And overall, we want to go from the sad fish to the happy fish, which would benefit us all. So for my acknowledgements, I would like to thank the Kostal Research Group, my PI, Dr. Kostal, and Dr. Rochkova Kostal. I'd like to thank the George Washington University and NSF for funding.
Okay, thank you, Geetesh. I'm not seeing any questions in the some compliments, but no questions yet in the chat. So if you have any questions, please enter them into the chat or turn your video on and unmute your mic and go ahead and ask. I do have a question for you. I didn't quite track sort of the range of chemicals that this model is applicable to. So could you help me better understand the parameters that define the scope of this model that you're looking at?
Well, we started with a bigger data set from the NIT database. So they had a different chemical classes all across the board. So we were just focusing on splitting the data into ionizable and then non-ionizable, and then breaking it down by chemical class after that.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Now there are a couple of questions. So we have one. How can this approach be applied more broadly in the future to both identify chemicals of concern and design safer, more sustainable ones?
So a good way is to take a prototype chemical and then run it through the model. And then if you would reach a threshold for BCF that would fall into either highly or very highly bioaccumulative, then you can kind of use that as a screening method to rule it out.
Geetesh, I'll take that one step further. Do you feel like you'll get to the point where you can have design parameters that can be given to those developing greener chemicals?
That would be the hope, since the goal would be to find mechanistic information. So we can find different reactivity and leverage that information, and that would give us a clearer picture on how these compounds accumulate.
Okay, have another question for you. This is very applicable. Is your model applicable to Pfast compounds?
It should be, yes. It's the same vein of thinking as the per halogenated compounds, so yes.
My experience has been that the Pfast compound bioaccumulation deviates quite a bit from the traditional octanol water partition coefficient predictions. And so it's often thought that there's a different mechanism there. But did you include any Pfast compounds in your study?
I think explicitly we haven't looked at it directly, but they are ionizable, so we should be able to kind of put it into the ionizable set and then model it from there.
Okay, good. Anybody else with additional questions? We have a little time here we can take. Okay, I'm not seeing anything else come up in the chat. So Geetesh, I thank you for your effort and your presentation here. It was very well done. Thank you. And with that, let's move on to our next speaker, Stefanie Wieck. If we can move on to the next slide. And then if we could just do a sound check, Stefanie.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. The podium is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, I would like to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak here on our study that colleagues from the Leuphana University of Lüneburg conducted on our behalf, Johannes Hohenberger and Klaus Kümmerer. And I would like to present to you now today our findings on how to find more sustainable chemical substitutes for anticoagulant rodenticides. Yes. So first, for the introduction, short words on the substitution of biocidal active substances. Unfortunately, biocidal active substances are no red dyes. So biocidal active substances are developed to harm organisms because they are intended to control organisms either that are harmful to human or animal health, or to control organisms that can cause damage to materials. So they should have an effect on organisms, and we have to deal with this desired effect. But because these substances can be problematic, a substitution option is already embedded in the European Biocides Regulation, where in its Article 17, it says that their use should be minimized to the minimum necessary by taking a combination of several different possibilities to control harmful organisms, and chemical alternatives are only one of those options. The substitution of biocidal active substances is a little bit difficult because they have to have an effect, they have to be effective, but this effect is not always necessarily visible to the eye. So if you have harmful organisms that you're not able to see, for example, bacteria or viruses, it's hard to see whether a product has been effective or not. And for non-chemical alternatives, for example, mouse traps, it is crucial that their efficacy is proven to make them available on the market, and especially make them successful on the market. So I'm sure I don't have to go into the details of the next slide, if it's now it's here, because basically what Article 17 of the Biocidal Products Regulation is saying is the principles of functional substitution. So looking at all these different levels where you can find alternatives for a chemical, which is not necessarily a chemical, but also product changes or systematic changes. And within our study, we applied this concept to anticoagulant rodenticides. Some short words on why we talk so much about anticoagulant rodenticides at the Environment Agency. But those substances are persistent or very persistent. They bioaccumulate or are very bioaccumulative. They are toxic. They have a low target specificity. Sorry, hard work. So they are prone to poisoning of non-target organisms. We have known resistance problems for some of those substances, and we can find residues from those chemicals in species all over the world. Here are some examples from Germany, but you can find them basically in every biota you sample. So those chemicals are quite problematic for the environment, but at the moment there are no chemical alternatives that are complete substitutes for those, and also the non-chemical alternatives cannot solve all problems. So we're trying to find ways to substitute them, those substitutions can take place on the different levels of functional substitution. So for example, if we try to change the system, we can renovate the sewer to prevent rats from nesting there, for example, or we can try to use traps. There are so many modern digital traps that are very useful for pest controllers, for example. Or we can, if we look at the chemical level, which is what I'm talking about today, we can try to find other chemicals that control mice and rats as well. At the German Environment Agency, we deal with all these levels of substitution. Here you can find some publications on product changes. For example, we developed efficacy and humaneness testing criteria for rodent traps, or try to change the system to prevent infestations before they occur. But today I will talk about the use of other chemicals, because in some cases chemicals are needed to control rodents. Within this study, we focused on 3 different time scales to substitute the anticoagulant rodenticides. The least time that is needed is if we try to replace the anticoagulant rodenticides with chemicals we already know are working, and only change the way we use those chemicals. On the medium time scale, we try to modify known chemical structures to make them better. And on the long time scale, we try to find new ways dealing with rodents and chemical alternatives. But yes, this will take quite some time. So I will talk about some of these strategies now in my presentation. For all those strategies, we applied evaluation criteria for substance proposals we made in this study. Those criteria focused on the effectivity of the chemicals, on the environmental criteria, and also on the practicability to use them later in the field against rodents. So, and we gave all chemicals points according to those criterions. There was -1, 0, and 1. So you can get 17 points max. And I will show you the results now on the next slide. Yes, here it is. When we apply these criterions to the anticoagulant rodenticides that are currently used and the 2 rodenticides with a different mode of action. What we can see is that the anticoagulant rodenticides only achieve 2 out of those 17 points. The 2 other chemicals with a different mode of action, alpha-chlorolose and cholecalciferol, reach more points. However, they cannot be used in all settings where anticoagulant rodenticides can be used, so they are not complete substitutes of those chemicals. As you can see, most of the substances, except for alpha-chlorolose, have an exclamation mark, which is meaning that all those substances fulfill exclusion criteria according to the biocides regulation. So if we would have alternatives on the market, all those substances would not be approved because, yeah, they have some criteria we don't want. So on the short-term strategies, so the least time required, however, we're talking in a regulatory context, so short-term means several years still. However, this is the shortest term we can talk about. So what we thought was, anticoagulants are not only used to control rats, anticoagulants are most often used to treat humans. So there are a lot of other chemicals already there that interfere with blood coagulation. And within the study, we had a look at a lot of different pharmaceutical active ingredients and rated them according to our criteria. And what we can see is that those anticoagulants receive much higher ratings than the rodenticides we're using at the moment. So these substances are much better for the environment. The advantages we see is that we have a known effect on blood clotting, so efficacy shouldn't be a problem. We know they can be applied orally because we only chose those that are given orally to patients, and we have already established production processes. However, we have no improvement on animal welfare because the rodents still bleed to death, which is not a very nice way to die. So no improvement on this and no increased target specificity because this mode of action works in all mammals. So the next strategy we identified is the use of stereochemistry because studies, especially by French colleagues, have shown that different configurations of anticoagulants show slightly different properties. There is more research needed, but there's already one active substance under review in the European Union at the moment, which is alpha-bromadiolone. The advantages we see using this is reduced bioaccumulation or persistence. At least this is what we would assume from the study results. Combined with this is a possibly reduced risk of secondary poisoning. We know they lead to blood clotting, and we know they can be applied orally. However, we do have higher production costs and again, no improvement of animal welfare or less primary poisoning. And the third short-term strategy is microencapsulation, a technique that is already used in several settings already since decades, I think. First, we could reduce primary poisoning if we would use selectively digestible coatings, for example, coatings that only rodents or at least omnivores can digest and carnivores, for example, can't. And we can also expand the spectrum of active compounds because we can release the compounds in a delayed way, which is very important to reduce bait shyness for rodents because rats are very intelligent animals. And with microencapsulation, we might be able to use acute poisons that won't work in an acute mode of action, but would be released delayed way. And this might enhance animal welfare because rodents might die much quicker than they do at the moment. And there are also acute toxicants that have higher ratings than the anticoagulant rodenticides, which might be used in combination with microencapsulation. So on the medium-term strategies, we're looking at a redesign of existing active substances by introducing specific groups that can interfere with the properties. And we can see this in brodifacoum and bromadiolone, two anticoagulant rodenticides, where a ring opening has a tremendous effect on degradability already. So if we try to take this further, we could reduce bioaccumulation or persistence, and with this reduce risk of secondary poisoning. However, we're still talking about anticoagulant rodenticides, so no improvement of animal welfare or primary poisoning. Of course, the best way would be starting from scratch with more target-specific mode of action, so no anticoagulation, but temperature regulation, blood sugar regulation, vitamin A regulation, things that are different depending on the type of animal, for example, between omnivores and carnivores, or small and big animals, where we could reduce a lot of negative impacts. We can apply benign by design green chemistry, safe and sustainable by design chemistry principles, which would be very nice. We can also use in silico methods. The paper down there is on this topic, and we've seen in the presentation before that there's a lot going on. However, of course, this is a tremendous effort, research effort, and would take quite a long time, but there's much to win using this approach. So on the conclusions, we see no breakthrough in chemical rodenticides control since the last decades. The second generation anticoagulants stem from the 80s. We've seen that possible alternatives with more favorable properties exist. For example, the pharmaceuticals. Of course, they need to be tested further, and after that, approved for use as a biocide. But if we apply relatively small modifications to the existing molecules, we could also improve the properties of those substances currently used. And of course, we would prefer to find completely new alternatives, because only those would be able to tackle all the problems involved with anticoagulant rodenticides at the moment. We've conducted this study to highlight the possibilities, to show possible approaches to solutions, and to encourage work on sustainable chemical alternatives, because those new chemical alternatives would be very important for the toolbox of chemical and non-chemical rodent control that we would need for the future. And the final report and the publication will hopefully be available soon. So with this, I would like to close, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Stefanie, and the timing was perfect. I didn't even have to step in. I'm checking the chat to see if there are any questions. Yes, one just popped up. Thank you, Stefanie. In San Francisco, to avoid second generation anticoagulants, we are trying birth control pharmaceuticals for rats. We also have tried dry ice CO2 injection into burrows. Have you tried these? If so, have you found them to be effective?
Yes, thank you for this question. We had a look at reproduction chemicals within the study as well, because of course this is an approach that has been tested. However, as soon as we interfere with reproduction, we will have endocrine disrupting chemicals. We have the problem with cholecalciferol as well, which is classified as an endocrine disrupting chemical, and all these chemicals would fulfill exclusion criteria from the European Biocidal Products Regulation. And for this reason, we're not so great fans of these approaches. In Europe, I don't think there has been birth control tested in practice, at least not since the biocides regulation. And regarding the dried ice, I've heard about it. I think, but I'm not 100% sure, but I think CO2 is also evaluated as a biocidal active substance. So it could be used against rodents in Europe, but at least in Germany, I know no one who's using dried ice against rodents.
So while we give another minute or so for people to enter their questions, I have a question for you. So in the long-term strategy with the de novo generation of new materials, greener, more sustainable, but effective materials, are there endpoints of interest that are being focused on? So clearly the anticoagulant is not appropriate long-term. You mentioned the endocrine disruptors from a birth control is not appropriate long-term. Are there particular endpoints or effects that are of primary interest to develop products for?
Well, within the study, the Leuphana University exploited some possible approaches that would be more target specific than anticoagulants. And one of those is ammonia excretion, because this seems to be different between animals depending on the way they feed, as well as glucose balance, and also the vitamin A balance. So these are approaches that we thought might work, but yeah, this would be still a long way to go. And also body temperature, because small rodents are more susceptible to this. And alpha chlorellose is already applying this principle because it's a narcotic, making the mice sleep, but it only works at low temperatures. So in warmer environments, this wouldn't work because the I don't know, sleeping mice won't die due to cold.
Okay, we have another question in the chat. Is there concern about pharmaceuticals being released into the environment by the rodents with unintended consequences on other organisms and the environment?
Yes, well, this is our main concern, releasing active ingredients into the environment and harming other organisms, which is what anticoagulant rodenticides are doing, and which is what other pharmaceutical active ingredients would do as well. However, we're trying to find those substitutes that have less effects. As I said in the introduction, biocidal active substances are designed to harm. So if we don't find a substance that is like directly degraded after excretion, for example, we will always might always find negative side effects of those chemicals, which is why we, of course, think that non-chemical alternatives are very important. But still, there are some cases where you need chemical biocides. And yes, we're trying to find the ones that harm the environment the least.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Can you say a bit more about the systems level changes for non-chemical alternatives, going back to the functional substitute diagram from the beginning of your presentation that are being discussed, even though these are not the focus of your research?
Yes, I could talk for hours about that, but I'm sure you don't want that. But yes, we think that this is the most important level, because this is the level where you have the most options, and preventive measures preventing the rodents from spreading are the most important ones from our point of view. So if we can make the environment, the sewer system or houses or food production facilities in a way rodent proof, to prevent rodents from thinking, oh, it's very nice to live here, I would like to have my babies here. We don't need rodenticides at all. So we have a town in Germany that is putting a lot of effort in sewer reconstruction, for example, and they don't use rodenticides in the sewer system at all. And other cities put a lot of anticoagulant rodenticides in the sewer system to control the rats. So there are examples that this can work very well, and also on the product level, because if you combine anticoagulant rodenticides with monitoring systems, and you can have very smart monitoring systems for rodents in the sewer systems at the moment. We have another town in Germany that reduced the use of anticoagulant rodenticides from 900 kilograms to 10 kilograms due to targeted use of rodenticides. And all these options have to be combined to get to a sustainable use of those products.
And Stephanie, let me just squeeze one more in. There's a question. Are there ways to build a better mousetrap, so to speak, that just uses a mechanical method rather than chemical to kill rodents? To me, that's a broader redesign of alternatives, or are they just impractical? And that builds on your last comments.
Yeah, there are. There's so much going on in the trap industry at the moment, to be honest, because killing rodents with the traps has to be humane as well. So we don't want to hurt, like only snap their leg and make them die because they can't eat anymore or something like this. But we want to kill them immediately. And this is why we at the Environment Agency developed efficacy testing for traps to find criteria how to build the best traps possible. And I can put the link in the chat later on. It was in the presentation as well. Yes, you can make them better, and there are very elaborated concepts for traps and sewer systems as well, where you would think that this is not possible, but there are very nice systems already on the market and used in municipalities.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. With that, we'll move on to our last speaker, Lei Huang. If you could bring the next slide up, please. Still waiting for Lei's slides. There we go. And Lei, if we could do a sound check with you, please.
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you. The podium is yours.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here today to talk about my studies on identifying safer alternatives for chemicals in the paints. And this is actually part of a project of United Nations. And we collaborate with colleagues in the Sri Lanka paint industry, and they would like to find safer alternatives for chemicals in their paint products. Oops, let me see. Oops. Okay, so interior paints, they contain chemicals that are known to be harmful for humans, but besides lead and VOCs, other chemicals in paints are seldom studied. The chemicals in paints can lead to near-field exposures of painters during the paint application and of building occupants afterwards. And the interior of homes can be repainted up to every year, such as in Sri Lanka, due to weather conditions, leading to increased exposures. So our overall objective is to identify chemicals of concern in those paints based on near-field human exposures and related health risks, and suggest potentially safer alternatives. Oops. How can I go back? Okay, here it is. So our study is based on the USOX near-field framework. This framework has 4 main components. So the first one is the chemical usage. It's obtained from the product use and the chemical content in the product. And the second part is the consumer exposure, calculated as the product intake fraction, the PIF. The PIF is defined as the chemical mass taken in per unit mass of chemical in a product via multiple exposure pathways. And the pathways that we consider for the paint include inhalation, thermal gaseous uptake, and direct thermal contact. The PIF is estimated using models, and then it's combined with the chemical usage to obtain the daily exposure dose, which is in milligram per kilogram body weight per day. And then this dose is combined with toxicity data to characterize the risk. And finally, we will calculate a maximum chemical content in paints and the hazard content ratio. And we use these metrics to identify chemicals of concerns and alternatives. For the chemical usage in paints, the chemical conversations are provided by Sri Lanka paint experts, and we focus on organic chemicals in this study. We studied 2 types of paints. The first is the water-based emulsion paint, also known as the latex paint, and it's composed of solvent, which is water, co-solvents, water-based binder, colorants, and biocides. And the second type is solvent-based animal paint, also known as alkyd paint. It's composed of organic solvents, co-solvents, and solvent-based binder, which is typically alkyd resin or formaldehyde-based resins, and also colorants. And one of our questions is that, is water-based paint really better than solvent-based paint? We use models to estimate chemical emission from the paints and the human exposures. So the paints undergo a wet phase and a dry phase when it's freshly applied. During the wet phase, the emission is controlled by evaporation. And we use a toolbox model, and I will describe it later. And during the dry phase, the emission is controlled by diffusion and partition. And we use a model that has been published in our papers. This model has been used to estimate chemical emissions from building materials. And we assume that the dried paint is like a building material. It's a very thin layer of solid material. Oops. This slide has a little problem, but that's okay. So this is a diagram of our toolbox model for the wet phase. We divide our house into 2 zones. There are 2 boxes. So one is the near field zone, and the second is the far portion zone. And the painter, he applies the paint on the near field surface, and which can be evaporated to the near person air. And then it will be transferred to the far person air and be finally ventilated to outdoor air. And as the painter is applying the paint, he will move along the surface. But in our model, we treated it as the painter is staying still, but the painted surface is moving. So it's represented by a transfer rate from the near person surface to the far person surface. This model is valid for water and about 90 organic solvents using the Abraham solvation parameters. For the model parameterization, we assume 70% relative humidity corresponding to the Sri Lanka weather. And we model an average residential house in non-OECD countries. We model 2 adults. One is the adult applying the paint, that's the painter. And the second is the bystander living in the house. That's the household member. And for the painter, we estimate the exposure and risks of one entire day of paint application. It includes 42 square meters of wall area. So we assume that the painter can only paint 42 square meters per day. And for the household member, we estimate the exposure and risks over 1 year. And they will have the wall area of the entire house painted. So it's 152 square meters. And we assume that the household member stays in the house during the paint application. And for solvent paint, we model the solvent as 12 different pure solvents. This slide shows the evaluation of our Wieck phase model. So for the prediction of the water drying dynamics and also the air concentration of a chemical metal emitted from alkyd paint and the prediction of drying time of water and 16 organic solvents. Our model agrees well with the experimental data. To characterize the risks for our for the cancer effects, we calculate an incremental lifetime cancer risks, which is multiplying the daily dose by the cancer slope factors. And for non-cancer effects, we calculate a hazard quotient as the dose divided by the reference dose. And then the hazard index is the sum of the hazard quotient across all exposure routes. So to identify the chemicals of concern and alternatives, we first calculate a maximum chemical content. That is the content in product not to exceed target Wieck levels, which is the hazard quotient equals 1 or cancer Wieck equals 10 to the minus 6. And we take the low Wieck concentration between cancer and non-cancer effects. And then we calculate a hazard content ratio, HCR, which is the actual content divided by the MEC. It shows how many times is the actual content too high to reach the target Wieck levels. So an HCR higher than 10 indicates high concern, and HCR less than 1 indicates it's potentially safe. Here's an overview of the exposure and cancer risks for the chemicals in the paints. So in each graph, the x-axis shows the dose, the y-axis is the cancer slope factors, and these 3 lines shows the cancer Wieck level of 10 to the minus 6, minus 5, and minus 4. And blue circles, they are inhalation exposures, and orange triangles, they are gaseous thermal exposure. And these purple squares are the direct thermal exposures, they are only applicable for the painters. And left column shows water paint, and right column shows solvent paint using silenes as the solvent. And upper graphs are for household members, and lower graphs are for the painters. So we can see that the exposure and Wieck are dominated by inhalation. And for the household member, only a few chemicals exceed the Wieck level of 10 to the minus 4 in water paint, but more than 10 chemicals exceed this level in the solvent paint. And for the painter, the exposure and Wieck are 1 to 2 orders of magnitude higher than the household member. And there are much more chemicals that exceed the Wieck levels of 10 to the minus 4. And overall, when we compare water paint and solvent paint, solvent leads to a higher Wieck than the water paint, since there are more chemicals that exceed the acceptable Wieck levels. Okay, here is a similar graphs for the exposure and non-cancer risks. It shows similar trend as the cancer effects, but it's less concerning because there are fewer chemicals that exceed the acceptable risk level. Here we take a closer look at each chemical in the paints, and this shows the solvent paint for the household member over a year. So the green bars, they show the actual chemical content in the paint, and the blue circles and the orange triangles, they are the maximum chemical contents based on non-cancer and cancer effects respectively. And the red stars, they are the hazard content ratios. And blue dotted line, it indicates the safe level. So if we see the red stars are above the black line, they are of concern. And this figure is for the solvents, co-solvents, and anti-spinning agent in solvent paint. And we can see that all of them are above the black line, so they are of concern. And this figure is for the colorants. And all of the colorants themselves are okay, but the solvent for the colorant is of concern. And in this case, it's the xylene. And this figure is for the solvent-based binder. And there were a lot of chemicals of concern, but they're mainly the solvents, including xylenes, acetylbenzene, benzene, and also formaldehyde here. As the formaldehyde is a residual monomer of the formaldehyde-based resins like phenol formaldehyde, urea formaldehyde. Here we compare 12 different organic solvents in the solvent paint, and the upper is the household member and lower is for the painter. And for household member, you can see that most solvents are okay, except the butyl acetate, xylenes, and methylene chloride. But for the painter, all of the solvents are of concern.
Lei, if you could wrap it up in 1 minute, please.
Okay. I will be quick. Now here is some chemicals in the water paint. So one is okay as it's water, but in the water-based binder, we also have the residual monomers that are problematic, including the styrene and vinyl acetate. And colorants are okay, but we have biocides used in water paint. Have several biocides that are of concern, including the formaldehyde and pentachlorophenol. So to compare water paint and solvent paint, we in this see that water paint is a safer alternative than solvent paint because it does not contain those harmful organic solvents and formaldehyde-based resin. But water paint uses biocides, where solvent paint does not need to, and biocides can have problems. So next we take a closer look at the biocides, and products use a mixture of biocide chemicals instead of chemicals. So we evaluate the product level, and we look at the 13 different biocide products, and this table shows the active ingredients. And in this figure, we shows in the non-cancer effects for each product, and the blue points are the cancer effects. And we can see that for wet stage biocides, the best alternative would be the product 2, 6, and 7. And dry field biocides would be product 9 and product 13. So in conclusion, our approach is a promising way to aid the development of more sustainable paint formulations. And we indeed confirm that water paint is better than solvent paint, and specifically we need to find better alternatives for the solvents in the solvent paint, and especially formaldehyde in the water paint. And our approach can be combined with other metrics to allow for more comprehensive evaluations of potential alternatives. That's all for my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lei. Appreciate it. Let me see if there are any questions. It looks like we have a few. Let's start out with some compliments, but also, is there a publication available? I'm sorry, that's a previous. No, is there a publication available for the biocides evaluation?
We haven't had a publication yet, but we are preparing it. Yeah.
Okay, and there's another question, comment. Thanks for your work. Really interesting. Did you identify or look for low chlorinated PCBs or chemicals of concern? They may have been shown to volatilize out of paints over time.
Well, we use the chemical compositions provided by the Sri Lanka paint experts, and in their compositions, the paints don't contain any PCBs. So we didn't look at any of the PCBs.
Okay, and then one more question. Have you thought about the deep eutectic solvents for these applications? And I apologize for the pronunciation of that word. I'm not familiar with it. EUTECITIC.
No, not really. Actually, I'm not familiar with this word either.
Okay, that's two of us. If we could get a clarification on that, that'd be great. Another one that came up, we have known that water-based paints are safer, more sustainable than solvent-based for a while, though hadn't thought about the biocides in them. What does your more exposure-oriented approach add to the literature on exploring alternatives?
I think, yeah, so the most important advantage of our approach is about exposure, because I think previously when we explore the alternatives, we may mostly focus on the toxicity or persistence of those chemicals, but we didn't look at the exposure. But actually, we found that exposure plays a very important role in determining the risk for chemicals that are of a similar toxicity. They can have very different exposure potentials, and so I think that's what our approach, the most important value that our approach adds.
Okay, we can give it another minute or so. Actually, we're running out of time here. Thank you, Lei. We appreciate the presentation. Let me just have a few closing remarks. If we could switch to the next slides. Okay, we see them up there. Just first of all, want to start by thanking all four presenters. Wonderful presentations, and there was some discussion in the chat, so there was really a great session. Appreciate all the effort that the speakers put into it. Just want to remind everybody that session 3 and session 4 are going to be held tomorrow, and so the topic tomorrow is going to be alternative assessments and informed substitution in policy. Part 1 will be lessons learned and insights for future policy provisions. And if we could go to the next slide, session 4 is the same topic, alternative assessments and informed substitution in policy. This would be part 2, and this would be lessons learned for more effective implementation. And then if I could have the last slide, please. Just want to again thank the sponsors. Without their generosity, this meeting would be very difficult to hold. And so again, thank you to our sponsors, and thank you to presenters again and everybody who joined us. That will be the conclusion of our session number 2 for today. So thank you.